The parts and pieces of our top are now all made. The first thing I need to do is check and see whether when I overlap my top section a 1/2 inch from the V in the bottom of the top and match up my hexies, and then match up the centers down here, my panel is short. When I cut the points off of this, there's going to be a gap. So I've cut an extra piece of black to sew on the bottom. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the points off the bottom of the top section. Okay? The bottom of the top section. Now when you lay these out, let me push over where you can see this better. Because this is an odd number of halves, I'm going to be lining up at the lowest point over here on the short side, and I want my lines to be fairly even with the lines in my hexies. So it looks like the point right here that's sewn is going to be in about the same position, and that's where I'm going to cut this one off. So you're just cutting the points off the bottom. I must need a new blade in that one. The bottom of the top section. The other thing I want to do is I want my clouds to blend. So I'm also going to cut part of this black off of the top section of the panel itself, so that that black will be in the seam. So that's step one, and I'm going to just keep rolling here. And so now these go on the top of my panel. Now I am going to cut off my first dog ear for this project in order to make sure that this fits properly. It's likely that my hexies are going to be fuller than the panel, so I'm going to pin along here, making sure those top edges are aligned and my corners are aligned. Yep, those are matched up. I can see the bottom, and I'm just pinning along but away from the edge. And what happens is if you put the fuller side on the bottom, your feed dogs help feed that any fullness in so that everything will sew together nicely. So we're going to sew this one, making sure we've got those edges nice and lined up. And I also can see from this side, I'm also checking my seams so they don't flip, but I can see that my seam allowance is keeping that black in the seam allowance, so it won't show after this seam is sewn. With any luck. That gets pressed out. Oh, that's going to look nice. And you'll notice that I had planned ahead, and my 5 half hexies are the same width as my panel, so I don't have to do any adjusting there. Now, if I line this up here and this up here, I'm going to go ahead and cut the top of the bottom section. I'm going to cut the points off the top of the bottom section. Same thing, I'm going to line up with the lowest point here, keep my lines pretty lined up, and the amount of seam showing across the top about the same. And I'm going to take those off. And now, when we lay these out, and I put this across the bottom, you'll see that that doesn't fit. But if I line that up there, and I take this fabric here, and I sew it on the bottom, then I will have plenty of extra across the bottom to line up with. So I'm going to sew this little border strip on the bottom of my panel. I'd rather have the extra black across the bottom. On large panels, this is not as big a deal because you have more leeway with your large panels. I'm going to step back here and press this. Okay. So now is the last tricky part. If you line up your hexies at the top and your hexie over here on this side at the top so that your points match, and I'm actually going to lay it on top of the panel, on top of the side sections, and then we lay this on and match up this bottom corner and this center. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take, and I know I have to trim the black section that I added, that's too much. I'm going to lay my ruler over a 1/2 inch because that's 2 1/4 inch seams. Now I do want to make sure that my panel is pretty square. So I may adjust just a hair to make sure this is square with my panel as well. And now when I pull the sides away and the bottom section away, that's what I need to trim off in order to make the panel fit the opening in my hexies. And so now, the moment of truth, I'm going to cut that particular dog ear off. And I'm going to pin these on. And I'm not as concerned about the bottom seems to be fitting better, and I don't feel like I need to ease it as much. So I think I may sew from the top on this one with the top on top of the panel. But I am going to line up my corners and put a pin where the seams are, and make sure those edges stay nice and lined up. And that's ready to sew. And now I'm going to step back here and give this a press. And now if I lay this out, my centers here and here both match, and my points here and here both match. And I'm ready to pin these on and sew the sides onto my top. Now this side, because I left a little more black, it'll have a small black frame on one side, but not on the other, because this black will be in the seam. And this one, because I want that black to stay in the seam, I am going to sew from the back side. And I'm matching up that point with the dog ears. And I'm matching up this point with the dog ears. And then I'm just stitching or pinning to keep the edges even. I don't have to worry about matching dog ears or points because I'm sewing along the edge of the panel. I think I will put one pin here just to hold that seam in place. And now this side is ready to stitch, and I think that black that's left on is a little bit wider than the seam I've been using, so I'm going to adjust my seam guide. And I'm going to ease these two points together for when I start. Make sure no seams flip all the way down. Yes, I'm glad I moved my seam guide over, because that seam allowance is just a hair bigger than the seam guide I had set originally. But at this point, all of my hexies are already sewn together, so I'm not worried about keeping a consistent quarter for those. And that side is on. And that gives a real nice look there with all of our clouds blending together. And then over here, I'm going to do the same thing, only I don't have to worry about those, the seam allowance on this side, because, well, actually maybe I do. I am leaving a seam allowance that's going to have some black, and I'd like it to stay pretty consistent. So I'm going to put pins in here where this dog ear would have been. And right here. And then I'm going to keep my edges even. And I'll be watching underneath to make sure my seams don't flip as I sew. I do that all the way through the whole project. I don't want any of those open seams to flip back open or flip closed because they will add extra bulk to those seams, which could make it harder to quilt later. And we have this point right here gets a pin, and one more right here where this seam comes together, and we're ready to sew the final seam to assemble our little top here. Checking my seams, watching that seam allowance as I go up the side here and keeping it even. And my pins are outside of where I'm sewing, so I don't have to remove them as I go because they're lengthwise right where I'm stitching. And the last little bit here, and I will pull that pin. And now your top is assembled and ready for pressing, with that little black frame on one side and across the bottom by the dark hexies. And your little top is done. So it's a matter of matching your hexies to the same width as your panel. If my hexies had been wider than the panel, I would have had to add extra black on the side. But on this one, I was able to make and plan and had them the same size. It wasn't long enough, and because I'm doing a mini, I'm doing a small one, there were no more hexies to play with. So adding a frame at the bottom rather than both at the top and the bottom left the clouds a nice array up here, and then just gave them a bottom that was dark here, and then matching your hexies so that your points match up again in the sides, at the top and the bottom, and you are good to go press and have a puffin wall hanging ready to go.